Hi everyone, it's Stephanie here and welcome back. In today's video, we are going to be creating some fun rainbow patterns using the Drifts and Hills stencil, similar to these cards here. These are cards that I have previously shared and I had a lot of questions about how I created them, so I wanted to share that in today's video. So in these samples, I did 3 different techniques. I did one with the Mandala die cut, I did a fun rainbow balloon pattern, and then I also did some emboss resist. But I did repeat the same process with all of them to create the fun rainbow pattern, so that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to create a bunch of different samples, and then we're going to turn them all into cards. So I do apologize, this video is a little bit longer than I normally do, but I wanted to create a bunch of different examples kind of showing you different ways that you can achieve this effect, and then I wanted to show you all of the finished cards at the end. So first up, we're going to do a word rainbow pattern. So I have the large hello die here, and I've cut it out of a piece of masking paper, and I've cut this just slightly smaller than my card base. You can cut this as big as the card base. It's completely up to you. The only area that we need to worry about is the hello part. That's where we're going to do all of our inking. So I've added this to my card front, and I'm also going to just put that O there just to kind of figure out exactly where I need the center to be placed. And then I'm going to press down really firmly to make sure that this mask is really nicely in place. We're going to be adding a lot of ink, and I don't want this mask to move at all while we're doing the inking. So to create the rainbow pattern, what I do is I just take the Drifts and Hills stencil and I lay it at the top area of whatever part I want to add the inking to. And I just take my ink blending tool and I start on the stencil and pull the color up from the stencil onto the area that I want to apply the ink. And what I like to do is I like to concentrate the color right against the stencil and then kind of let it go lighter as I work my way up towards either the top or the next color. So for this one, since it is the top, you do want to make sure you fully cover the letters with the ink. You just want to add a little bit of a lighter touch when you get near the top. That way you're going to have the definition of the letters once you're finished. Now I'm going to speed through these because they are the exact same thing over and over, just with different colors. But what I'm doing is I'm just turning my stencil in various ways to get different looks every time I add the ink. And then I'm repeating the exact same process, adding the ink darkest near the stencil and then letting it go lighter as I make my way towards the next color. And you just want to be careful that you don't go over top of the color that you're blending into. So you just want to kind of meet it at the darkest line, but you don't want to have that color go right into that second color. And then for the last color here, I don't really need the stencil because we're going to just do the very bottom of the word, but I like having the stencil to kind of have that slippery surface to pull the ink off of. And then once we're done the inking, we get to do my favorite part, which is to remove the mask. And we're left with this great large hello word, and we have this really fun rainbow pattern that we've created inside that word opening. So now we're going to be able to layer a second sentiment or anything else that you kind of want to add to this. Now I did get a little bit of ink on the right side there, you can see it, but I had already planned to cut this down with a stitch rectangle die, so I'm not too worried about having that ink over there. So we're going to set this one aside and we're going to move on to the next one. So for this one, I'm going to do some inking on an actual die cut. So this is a really fun technique if you have a die similar to this where it's nice and large and you can use it as a focal point on your card design. So I'm just repeating the exact same process, but this time I've decided to only use 2 colors of distress ink versus a rainbow pattern. So I have Twisted Citron and Peacock Feathers, and I'm just going to keep this blue and green in color. And I'm just repeating the same process. I'm taking my stencil and moving it down along this Mandala die cut until I have it completely covered with ink. Now I did fight there for a little bit at first trying to keep the stencil on the mandala and not have it shift around, but then I decided it was easier to add a little bit of tape at the top there since I had already inked it, and that just helped to hold it in place a little bit better. And I did want to mention that you do want to use a paper towel or something to wipe off the stencil between each color. Otherwise, you're going to transfer the color that you were originally using into the next color since the stencil is a slippery surface and that ink is just going to kind of sit on top of it. So now I have that mandala done. Let's go ahead and set that one aside and move on to the next one. And this one is just using a regular 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white panel. And we're just going to ink directly on here and create a pattern. So we're not going to do any die cutting or use any masks. We're just going to use the stencil directly on this panel and then use this as the focal point on our card design. So for this one here, I decided to once again create a rainbow pattern. I actually am going to do rainbows for the rest of these now. The mandala is the only one that I did with 2 colors. And for this one, I'm starting at the top with my purple color and I'm going to work my way down in the rainbow colors towards the bottom. So for the first color here, I want this one to kind of fade off into the white. So I'm starting on the stencil like I did previously, and I'm letting it be nice and dark along the stencil line, and then I'm just very carefully kind of lightening my pressure, and I'm letting it lighten up into the white area at the top. And now I'm just going to repeat the same process and go all the way down this panel with all of my various colors. I do like the effect of having the lighter color at the very top of each piece of color, so I did continue to do that as I went. And I decided for this one that I didn't want to rotate the stencil. I didn't want to kind of have a variation in the design. So I kept it exactly the same and tried to keep the spaces for the colors kind of the same as well, so that I would have a continuous pattern all the way down except for the change in colors. This panel here ended up being one of my favorites. I just really love this kind of wavy pattern that was achieved with the stencil, and I just think it's a fun and unique way to use the stencil and just a regular old panel of cardstock to create a really fun, colorful card design. For the bottom portion, I didn't worry about using the stencil. I just laid my panel directly onto my grid paper, and then I'm just using my purple, which is the same color we used at the top, to finish off the pattern since I had one more space left and had run out of colors. And I actually like the look of the purple at both the top and the bottom. Now for this example, I've die cut a heart from a piece of masking paper and I'm adding this to my card front. Now this is just a white cardstock panel and I'm adding this on here with some post-it tape. I don't actually have the backing removed off the mask yet. I want to use this mask twice, so I decided to just kind of hold it in place with some repositionable tape for the first part, and then I'll remove the backing when we're going to do the inking. So for this one, I want to do some emboss resist in the heart pattern. So I have the text background stamp here, and I've just applied some Versamark ink to that stamp, and I'm just laying this whole panel right on top and using my fingers to transfer that ink onto my cardstock panel. And since we have the mask in place, we're only going to transfer the stamped image onto the heart pattern and not anywhere else. So once I remove the mask and add the white embossing powder, you can see that I have that great text detail in the shape of a heart in the center of our panel. Once I have the embossing heat set, I'm going to then take the same mask and remove the backing sheet, and I'm going to apply this right onto the panel, right over top of where I did the embossing. So I just want to make sure I position it exactly how I had it when I did the emboss detail, so that I know that all of that text is going to be in exactly the right spot inside of the mask. So now it's time to add the ink to our heart, so I'm going to repeat the same process that I did in the previous versions. I'm just going to concentrate the color in the area where the heart is. I did add post-it tape all the way around this before I started the inking so that I didn't get any on the panel, because I originally had planned to keep this as a full panel, but I did end up cutting it down, so that's completely optional. You don't have to add that extra post-it tape if your mask doesn't fully cover the surface. So I'm just using the same colors that I used previously, except for this one here. I did use Worn Lipstick in place of the Abandoned Coral. And here's a little bit of a closer look at me applying the ink to this area. And the great thing about this technique is that that white emboss detail, so all of that text that we've stamped on there, is going to show through the color and just give us a really fun look. Now for this one, I decided to use 2 shades of green, so I used the Twisted Citron as well as the Mowed Lawn, and then I ended with my peacock feathers at the bottom. I like to take a paper towel and just kind of buff the surface, which helps to remove any of that excess ink off of there. And then we can go ahead and remove the mask, which is always, like I mentioned, my favorite part. And we're left with this beautiful rainbow heart that has this great emboss detail in the center. I love the look of Emboss Resist. I think it's something that I will never get tired of seeing or doing. And I really think it looks so nice with this rainbow pattern that we've created with the distressings in the stencil. So the last sample I want to share before we start to put our cards together is this one here. And this one is similar to the Shears card that I shared at the beginning of the video. So what I did is I just took some post-it tape. You can see it positioned here on the panel now. And before I started to add the ink, I did the same thing with the post-it tape and stamped a design in the center area there. And then heat embossed it similar to what I did with the heart. Once I had it heat embossed, I added new post-it tape in the exact same position, and now I'm adding this ink color to this whole area in the center of these 2 post-it tapes. So once again, it's the exact same inking technique as before. This time I'm just concentrating the color in between those 2 post-it tapes where I have heat embossed the Wavy coloring book background stamp. And then once I'm done with the color here, I'm just going to remove both of the masks. So I'm pulling this one here off of the bottom, and then I'll remove that larger mask on the top to reveal our full pattern. And this one here, I am going to leave a full panel. I want to have that color kind of stretch from one side to the other. So now we have created all of these samples. We have a bunch of different ways that we've used the Drifts and Hill stencil with the distress inks. So now we can start to create some cards with the various panels. So the first one here, I'm going to actually show you the creation of the card because I want to show you the sentiment that we're going to add on here. So I have this fun panel that we've just added the waves of color to, and you can see when I add my hello die, which I want to be in white, it kind of blends in with the background. So a great way to make your sentiment stand out is to create a shadow for it by die cutting the exact same sentiment out of a different color of cardstock. For this one, I'm using steel gray because I want it to have a nice dark color, which is really going to stand out against that rainbow pattern background. And I'm just going to adhere it directly underneath of my white one and just kind of offset it a bit. So I've moved the white one down a tiny bit and over to the right before gluing them together. And what that does is it creates a shadow effect behind that word and really helps it to stand out against our busy, colorful background. So now that I have those glued together, I'm just using the From the Heart stamp set and adding a sentiment to a little banner that I've die cut. I've added that to the panel, and now I'm going to add our hello word directly over top of the banner. So you can see now when I position this onto the card, that gray that we've added to the back of the die cut word really helps everything to stand out, and it almost makes it look like the word is popping off of the card. So I really love the effect that you can achieve with adding that second layer underneath of a die cut sentiment. And then once that's done, I just added this to a top folding white card base, and that is going to complete the card. So let's go ahead now and take a look at all of the samples that I turned into cards. I have all of them onto an actual card now. So first up, I have the 3 original cards. I have the Shears card, which is the Emboss Resist in a strip on the panel. And then I just used a die cut sentiment and a sentiment stamped on a banner. This one here is the Magical Mandala that I did a rainbow pattern on. And then I added my sentiment straight across that on the card base. For this one, I created a mask with the balloon STAX Die-namics, and then I just did that fun rainbow pattern in the center area of the mask to create a fun rainbow effect, and then I added the sentiment directly on top. This one here is similar to the Cheers card, but for this one, I moved the strip down towards the bottom area of the card and did the sentiment with the shadow underneath. This fun rainbow panel that we created without any dies is the one that we also did the shadow effect on the die cut word, and then I added a secondary sentiment underneath on a stamped banner. Our rainbow hello was trimmed down with a stitch rectangle die and matted onto a grape jelly card base, and then I also added a secondary sentiment underneath and some of the enamel hearts. Our embossed heart pattern was cut down and added to a Summer Splash cardstock mat, and then I added the hug sentiment, which was die cut from silver sparkle cardstock, and layered it onto some gray for that same shadow and dimensional effect, and I added a secondary sentiment underneath. And lastly, we have our Mesmerizing Mandela, which just has the 2 colors on it, and for this one I put it onto the center of my card panel, and then I put my sentiment on a diagonal to kind of go in the same direction as the inking on the mandala. And then I added a couple of gems kind of throughout the mandala just for some added detail and dimension. So that is all of our cards. There is quite a few different samples here and a bunch of different ways to use the Drifts and Hills stencil with distress inks to create some really fun rainbow effects. I definitely hope you will give this a try. It's a lot of fun just to kind of play with all of the colors and create different patterns and kind of look at all of the dies you have on hand to see what kind of masks and different designs you can create. So thank you so much for joining me in today's video. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you in another video soon. Thanks for watching.